Hey there everyone! Recently I played the game Heartbound by PirateSoftware games. PirateSoftware is extremely infamous within the gaming community and even beyond it because of his aggressive stance against the Stop Killing Games initiative, an organized attempt to put pressure on game corporations to distribute software in more fair ways that would allow for the user to maintain control over what they own. For those out of the loop, media, software, and streaming services, especially the video game industry, have been molecularizing their revenue streams in response to tapering sales in previous models focused around individual unit sales. This is the market movement which is what motivated constant streaming services all over the web. Since the commercialization of the internet, people have noticed major transitions in the interface surrounding popular media and fandoms. Recognizing the cultural soft power embedded in their IPs, corporations have slowly been introducing barriers, complex conditions, dark UI patterns, monitoring and data collection systems to more and more closely infiltrate our lives, to better understand exactly how we use these systems. These companies have demonstrated time and time again how easy it is for them to strip control from users by simply disabling resources. Concepts like the cloud were introduced as revolutions to consumers, but their main purpose is to allow corporations to maintain full control over how you use your software and technology through an electronic leash via signals across the internet. Not only this, but restrictions on user control even leads to complex issues like limited accessibility options for users in many user interfaces, all for the sake of monetization. Personally, I am of the opinion that if your monetization model interferes with accessibility, reconsider. Something that I really try to emphasize on my channel, especially to people who are unfamiliar with the granular details of technology, is the importance of the relationship that we have with technology. The whole reason why Félix Guattari was even interested in radio and other forms of piracy in the first place is because he fundamentally believed that technology is something that needs to make sense to us in our own lives. His philosophy was that technology was a tool, but so was the language used to convey how to connect to it. When we look at the interface of any device or appliance, we are presented with a series of buttons, dials, and gadgets that direct our bodies to engage into a larger system. Knowing this, these companies can then mass-produce interfaces that further and further restrict the freedoms of individuals so that more and more surplus value can be extracted from every orifice. The situation has gotten so dire that even completely programmed victims of Nintendo copyright propaganda have realized that piracy is a more realistic and effective option. If only they'd have listened before. It is this that rests at the heart of the Stop Killing Games movement, and so it is actually quite important despite most being focused on entertainment currently. The issue is a symptom of a much larger disturbance in our relationship with technology. Ironically, it is the developer PirateSoftware who has stepped up to the opposition of this movement. It's kind of crazy that this guy named his company after what you should do with his games. His aggressive opposition led to a massive exposé that revealed him to be a Blizzard Nepo baby, but they also started flocking towards his Undertale-like game, Heartbound. Now, let's be fair, Undertale ripoffs are a dime a dozen. This is not anything unique, but this game turned out to be another yandere dev situation. A developer, completely inexperienced and in over their head, attempts to develop a game they have no business attempting, leading to an entire decade of cringe behavior and a notable lack of development. This led to even more public humiliation for his corporate behavior, which he fully deserved. However, this essay is not really concerned with the details of any of that. Months ago, many other YouTubers have already revealed all of these details already. Instead, I think a far more valuable thing to do would be to analyze the UI problems that the game creates. Heartbound is infamous for its poor design decisions, but what exactly makes them so bad? here, I think it would be useful to reference the ideas discussed in an essay called Year Zero Faciality, which appears in a book called 1,000 Plateaus by Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari. If you are familiar with this book, you might be a bit confused by the choice of this book in particular when analyzing user interface. It's long, confusing, and mostly seems concerned with things that are certainly not about programming, including this part. However, I actually believe that the concepts introduced in this essay are actually very valuable for analyzing interfaces. See, what they describe in this chapter is a thing called a Faciality Machine. I've made a video already that goes into more detail about what this plateau, as they call it, is about, but what you need to know here is that they are exploring a function that they believe exists in the study of semiotics, or how signifiers such as images, icons, or words relate to meanings. They propose a model that consists of two parts: a white wall of signifiance, which is like a surface with a bunch of possible meanings that can emerge from it, and black holes of subjectivity, which is like a special function that absorbs these possible meanings and arranges them around subjects. When these two things come together, it creates a surface that can transform a wide variety of inputs and interactions into a set of binarized values, allowing for the transformation of potentially millions of possible inputs to be transformed into game interactivity. What's truly fascinating about the Faciality Machine is that it's actually a very abstract concept. While it has been used to explore themes such as framing in film, a subject also explored within the plateau itself, or racial profiling, what truly makes it significant is that the faciality machines are everywhere around us, including video games. In fact, this abstraction of the faciality machine allows for seemingly unrelated subjects, such as racism in video games, to find a common ground in how they both facialize subjects through this binarization. An excellent and insidious example is how the controversial Call of Duty mission No Russian facializes a scenario that categorizes Russian civilians in an airport as military targets. This faciality can then connect to the faciality of racial and national programming, constructing a subjectivity embedded in the minds of those in the West to encourage hyper-militarization and exploitation of world resources. In games that are well made, such as Call of Duty, this machine is so effective that you probably won't even notice it, which is very concerning. But in a game like Heartbound, the problems can be more easily seen, and so we can study this machine in more detail on the borders of where it fails. Effective communication is an essential part of any video game. It is what organizes completely random audiovisual chaos into structure, creating a machine between the player and the game through its interface. This communication ranges from direct explanations, such as tutorials or help menus, or it can be explained narratively, such as how many characters in the Pokemon games serve to explain a small part of the game to the player. However, not all the communications are contained within the game itself. In the past, when games were more primitive, this would also often include external materials, such as user manuals, player guides, magazine columns, and even tip lines in the case of Nintendo. All of this helps refine the internal structure and understanding of the game that the player has, and aligns it with the developer's desires. Over time, the video game and the player become more and more aligned, until in high-level play we see the two nearly becoming one, and demonstrating the limits of possibilities within these games through speedrunning and competitive play. However, Heartbound greatly struggles with communicating effectively with its players. The issues start as early as the title screen. When you first boot the game, the title screen greets you with a large heart-shaped button and a continue button below it. I thought that was odd that there would be a continue button at the beginning of the game, so I just assumed it was an early access bug and instead clicked the heart-shaped button, assuming that it was the start game button. This actually turned out to be the credits. This was so confusing at first that I interpreted that he had put the credits before the beginning of the game, only to find myself dumped onto the title screen after. This offers a good opportunity to analyze exactly what's going on here with a basic user interface like a title screen.
Continue. Okay, do I click that? Okay. Alright.
He's making me go through the credits first, really? Can I get through it? Okay, I gotta do it. Ugh. Alright, sorry, this might cause a migraine. Oh my lord. Is there a way to skip this? Is there a way? Oh my god, I can't skip this? Okay, alright, okay, that's how. What? What did I do? What did I do? This is the credit. See, if we look at the game without paying any attention to what anything is going on screen, it's just a wall of potential signifiers. It really doesn't mean anything at all. Something that's really apparent in this game's inability to explain anything clearly. Psst, that's why it doesn't make any sense. We call this surface of signifiance a white wall, even if in this case it's not really white. What's important here is that a bunch of potentially signifying stuff, so possible meanings, are moving around here. Then those meanings get assembled into an interface that can transform any random movement into a binary yes or no input. For example, when you press a button, it transforms a whole range of possible movements into pressed or not pressed. This is, in fact, how key inputs work on the programming level. But in order for this to happen, we need to concentrate a subject on this surface. These subjects absorb inputs, like mouse movements, keyboard or controller input, but also things like your eyes and even your thoughts, and concentrate this signifying surface around them. We can think of the different buttons on the screens as being little black holes that suck our interest towards specific binary functions, such as clicking the new game button, that concentrate these meanings in specific places. For example, the social media icons, yeah, gross, I know, direct the player towards the social media machines that PirateSoftware set up to promote the game. However, this is not the only semiotic machine at play here. It's actually incredibly important what flows between the lines. As one example, having them in the top left corner means that for people who read languages that read left to right, like English, will often naturally see these icons first, since in English we read from top to bottom and from left to right. There are a whole multitude of functions like these, ranging from the player's previous expectations to their native language to individual preferences, that will direct how a person organizes these signs on a screen. And good UI designers who like to experiment with expression love to tap into these uncoded flows to create new kinds of experiences. This means that in this instance, we as English speakers usually see the social media links first when we take a closer look. A fantastic example of these A-signifying machines in UI design in video games would be Undertale, where Toby Fox uses not only UI elements directly, such as the design of the battles, but uses a complex assemblage of audiovisual storytelling, UI interactions and junctions, game structure, and narrative choices to create a unique experience that explores in depth various ideas, such as violence in video games, and the meaning of what an RPG battle can represent. So with all of that in mind, what does Heartbound do? Unfortunately, it fails to engage the player on the very first screen. After all, what do you think that big heart representing the game's logo and central core concept of a split light and dark personality on the title screen, with contrasting visual effects when you hover over it, indicates to the player? It seems that he has done everything to attract the player towards the button like a black hole. In fact, this positioning conveys to the player a whole multitude of things. When we consider most games in this style, usually the new game button is located in this area, and if instead alternately presented in a cinematic manner, it may be conveyed by a highly dramatic, visually attractive button, encouraging the player to interact with it. This can often appear on the first time a player boots a game, and then is replaced with a more traditional text-based interface. This makes sense for a new game function because the player will most likely want to play the game immediately after the title screen, and if they don't, they can look around the screen for other choices like options or credits. So this black hole attracts most paths towards where it wants to be anyways. The desiring machine is working and the circuit is completed. But now if we look at Heartbound's example, things start to fall apart. This super visually attractive button leads to the credits instead. This is not what the player thought would happen. The credits are considerably more boring, and like many people like me will assume that it's just a new game button. To make things even more confusing, the actual new game button is labeled continue, which typically only is reserved for continuing a save file, since this allows players to start a new game despite having a current save file, encouraging the player to avoid the button that actually allows them to start the game. When the player's desire tries to circuit through this machine, instead of being met by a new game, it's instead met by a bunch of boring text. Now the player has to search for a new game interface and reconstruct completely new codes to make sense of any of this. This takes mental energy, which really should be spent enjoying the game. Of course, this is not to say that design should be standardized. That's exactly the opposite of what I think should happen. Rather, I think that developers need to think clearly about what the desiring machines they are producing. Ask yourself, how am I drawing the player towards the destination goal? Many gamers joke about orange paint or signs pointing to a location, but actually all game design is fundamentally about leading players along. Without a signifying orange paint, you're left with something like Heartbound. They do not realize that despite all of the wide range of their actions, that their endpoint is either one of three options. 1, to quit the game. 2, to reach one of the predefined endpoints, or a special third thing, to create an entirely new destination through glitching and hacking. This core problem with communication and the lack of ability to establish clear subjects for the player to interact with leads to one of the biggest problems in this game, whether it be textual narratives in the user interface or expressed visually. The text in particular is quite egregious. Despite having 6 available languages on the language select screen, this is all meaningless if nothing actually makes any sense. Heartbound uses a lot of really confusing word choices and fails to establish a clear continuous world. Again, compare with Pokemon or Undertale, where every line of dialogue functions towards funneling the player towards a certain understanding of a complex machine of game mechanics and narrative. There is, of course, the well-known and talked-about issue with the game's cheesy and amateurish writing. This in of itself is not really a problem and could even be charming under the right circumstances. This in of itself doesn't make the game difficult to play, just somewhat annoying. Rather, the issue lies in 2 main problems. First, the dialogue is far too excessive, and the UI does not allow the player to scroll through the text faster, encouraging the player to mash the continue button instead of reading the text. Second, the text itself is often irrelevant and full of padding and forced characterization that encourages the player to further skip it. This leads to major issues because the text is so boring and useless that most players will try to skip it, only to find out that halfway in the conversation something important was said. But talking to the character afterward reveals nothing about what to do. What do I do? Do I talk to the mushrooms? No. Do I talk to him again? Clickety now, Squire. What? Tell me what to do! What am I supposed to do? Oh my god. Reminder text like this is so trivial that it is practically expected in games, and seeing it neglected is genuinely surprising. PirateSoftware should concentrate his dialogue towards trying to achieve a purpose from the perspective of the player. That way, it can be used as another tool to help navigate this world that he's created. One particularly annoying issue, which occurs with the save feature, is that every time you try to save the game, you are asked if you want to take a rest. I only did this once, which appeared to return me to my room, only for me to leave and to return back to the place of the save location. This was extremely confusing and not communicated clearly at all. It felt somewhat like a warp glitch. Not only this, but the purpose of resting at home is not clear at all. There are no random battles, and as far as I went, there was only 2 battles, which seemed to have full healing event between them. So it doesn't serve to recover HP or anything like that. It's genuinely confounding what this is supposed to do, similar to the majority of the game. There's so many mistakes like these that I could make an entire video documenting them, but that would be incredibly boring, and I'd rather not. There are examples, however, that I think PirateSoftware gets communication right, and it's worthwhile to point these out. The most notable example was the highly memorable Shy book. Talking to one of the books in the magical library results in it timidly pulling away from your hand, to which Binder, Yeah, I'm still shocked that he named the Asgore clone after a garment used by transgender men to hold their breasts back. But Binder explains that the book is shy and needs to open up to the player. This is actually a fantastic example of world building that makes the book seem magical and like as if they have personalities. Compare this with other flavored text in this game, such as when he's talking about the books being glued together, some sort of dense lore that I have no idea about, and this thing about a mama? What? Like, seriously, the whole game is filled with shit like this, and it really makes you wonder what he was thinking when he was clearly had the capability to actually write interesting flavor text interaction. All of this leads to another issue, the limited ability for this game to express anything deeper than what it communicates in text boxes. Part of the reason why it depends so heavily on text boxes is because there's actually very little other functionality in this game. Unlike most RPG or adventure games, there's no inventory that the player can interact with. The most we get are key items that are controlled presumably by story flags. This offers very little interactivity for the player because they can't use items. Think about how many times in adventure games that an item was used in your inventory to progress. As you can see, having no inventory is very limiting, and does ultimately have real consequences for the narrative quality of Heartbound. Let me give an example of how having so few options limits the potential of what can be expressed with the game by focusing on the player's dog. At the beginning of the game, you are greeted to numerous cutscenes about feeding your dog early in the morning. These scenes serve the purpose to reinforce to the player that there is a close emotional connection to the dog. However, me and my audience just saw this as incredibly emotionally manipulative and predictable. There's a common saying in storytelling that I'm sure you all know, called show, don't tell. In these scenes, the game is telling us very directly that we should have feelings for this dog, and even tells you how awesome your friendship with this dog. But wouldn't it be way cooler to actually be able to experience it directly? After all, this game does model an RPG. Let's go back to the white wall and black holes for a second. Imagine if pirate games arranged a different interface that had black holes arranged in a way to create the subject of a battling minigame. There are subjects like enemies, you, your ally, the dog, items, attacks, win condition, loot, the list goes on and on. By simply adding these new kinds of effects that line the borders of what the experience you are trying to create is, you give yourself more opportunities to express and clarify that experience. By adding all of this, we do not need to tell the player directly to love the dog. Instead, we can make the player spend a lot of time with the dog and truly get attached to it. This would allow the player to truly experience becoming close to his dog by battling and learning the basic mechanics of the game as he progresses through the woods. Then, when the dark monster kidnaps the dog, the emotional impact is much greater. Not only this, but the structure would unify many otherwise random elements that are beat over our head in a single white wall black hole system. For example, the axe and the dog no longer are just separate objects, but now the axe is a weapon and the dog is a companion, part of a larger landscape of the story that the developer is trying to produce. The best part is that it can still fit in very cleanly with pirate games' intended themes of duality and the shadow self. And in fact, it would be a lot more dramatic and interesting. At its core, Heartbound is functionally a walking simulator. Now, there's nothing wrong with a walking simulator. There are plenty of interesting games that only require the player to walk around and interact with things. Complex game mechanics are not necessarily required to make a great experience. However, in those games, instead of using text to convey every aspect of the game, they often utilize avant-garde presentation or unique narratives to keep players interested. With Heartbound, there are two options, moving around and reading text boxes, or the two battles, which can be best described as minigames. The battles, like the overworld, are extremely limited, and only consist of a sequence of minigames. A major issue with these minigames is that the goal is never telegraphed to the player. Compare with WarioWare, for example, where microgames are able to communicate their intended interaction through a complex intersection of audiovisual signs, references to other games or real-life phenomenon, and very importantly, a word or two that exclaims to the player what to do. It is not just instructing what to do to the player, but it pumps them up with an energetic presentation that gives a short period of time for the player to identify the situation and brace for the minigame. Notably, unlike Heartbound, these games are also extremely simple, often only requiring one input or goal to complete within a few seconds. In contrast, Heartbound's battle sequences do nothing to instruct the player how to interact. No tutorial, no basic flavor text, absolutely nothing. Some of these games were self-evident, such as the meteors dropping, but others took many attempts to figure out, such as the Simon matching game. This led to me feeling like the game was extremely unfair. I didn't even know what was expected from me. In one case, one of the minigames even spawns a window that appears outside of the main battle window, which was completely outside of my mental view of the battlefield, despite it being right next to it, which made a critical aspect of the game completely invisible to me at first. With the battles being the same sequence of 4 or 5 minigames over and over again, you eventually will learn how to play the games because there is quite literally nothing else to interact with. Like a Skinner's box from hell, you are forced into a tiny chamber to peck randomly until you manage to find the target, and a treat may be dispersed to induce operant conditioning. As you can imagine, we really should not have to resort to such brute force methods to teach people how to merely play your game. What else can the game even offer? Well, the majority of my stream was spent in low visibility mazes. Oh god, please not the mazes. Oh my lord, this is horrible. Why? Oh my god, this is genuinely awful. What the why? I hate you! This is like the worst part of the game so far. I hate this. This is worse than Rock Tunnel in RBY. Like, this is legit terrible. I would rather have 20 Geodudes and Zubats up my ass right now. A more subtle aspect of video game design that both gamers and designers take for granted, at least until it breaks, is the human interface element between the game itself and the player. This is the part of user interface design that is less about how elements are organized on a screen or through speakers, and more about how the user physically interfaces with the game. For example, your keyboard. The keyboard is also a white wall black hole machine too, believe it or not. Think about it, your keyboard has a surface that's full of signifying potentials that has black holes surrounding each key to teach your hands where to go. In this case, your hands and finger movements are facialized into a system to make it more connected. In this way, over time, you are actually becoming more and more integrated into this machine itself, losing your individual subject and becoming enslaved to the process. This is how speedrunners and top-level competitive players are able to adapt so quickly in their respective environments. These players are not just simply choosing whatever way they want to play the game. The machine and the human has become one to optimize desirable paths. But all good games will begin to integrate the player after some familiarization. But of course, this is not just the keyboard doing all the heavy lifting here. There is at least 2 machines connected when you are typing with your keyboard. You and your keyboard. If the keyboard layout is poorly designed or it requires changes in your layout frequently, it can lead to a complete breakdown of immersion. Why might that happen? Well, in order to sustain itself, the process that produces this interaction is much more important than just the surface of the game itself. Similar to how the game cannot sustain itself if it communicates unclear goals to the player, it also can't sustain itself if it has major confusing human interface issues. You will just get frustrated and want to quit, just as I had. In the case of Heartbound, the most notable example is how often the game expects you to switch to your mouse. This is not optional, by the way. It is expected of you, and you are only given a few seconds to adapt. Not only must you mentally rearrange the entire surface between you and the computer every time this happens, but you must also have to read what is on screen as well and transform those movements into appropriate action. This may seem like a fun challenge to the developer, but this extensive code switching is exhausting and offers little in the realm of a skill ceiling. Again, you must condition yourself to adapt to the circumstances, which is no way to design a game, in my opinion at least. Overall, it is generally advised that you stick to a control scheme when you're building a game. If you want to have a game that combines mouse input and keyboard input, you should have this consistent in your game and integrate both heavily into all aspects of your game. For example, if you expect me to use the mouse, it would be nice to be able to click my mouse and pathfind to a particular location. But most of the time, the mouse is useless, except in a couple of necessary minigames which ultimately leads to constant code switching in these battles. The worst part is that the battles actually switch rapidly between mouse-based and keyboard controls, making everything even more confusing. I should use either one interface or another through the whole game. That's it. I do think that it is important to make a note on accessibility.
Oh, brother, this guy stinks!
I am someone who suffers from severe nauseating migraines and from positive psychotic episodes, which I believe to be schizoaffective disorder, but is currently diagnosed as bipolar. Both impact not only my ability to play most modern video games, but also can completely debilitate me for extended periods if it fails. Unlike common accessibility issues like color blindness, where it offers mostly an annoyance or potentially even an inability to play the game, these accessibility features have tremendous impacts after playing the game that can render me unable to function for hours. Despite this, migraines and psychosis remain two highly misunderstood disabilities within the accessibility community. As a result, most modern games are completely unplayable because of a major lack of consideration for my needs within the industry, especially as they conflict with modern visual game design tropes. I did not scope the game for other potential accessibility issues, but I do think it is important to talk about game design issues that impacted my direct experience, especially since the user experience of both is poorly understood. My hope is that developers, primarily indie developers, watching this can at least adapt some improvements to make their games more functional for people like me, because of the serious impact failure has on our lives. Regarding migraines, the graphics were often very uncomfortable to look at. I advise any game developer to focus your visual design on 1. Simplicity. The best solution is the one that delivers the most believable experience with the least amount of crap. Contrast and clearly defined objects so that they can be clearly seen. And access to reduced motion. At least allow for an alternative for reduced motions, particles, blur effects, etc. in your interfaces. For example, Undertale is much easier on the eyes for a person who gets migraines like me because the character designs are clear and distinct, the maps are easy to see, and there's high contrast throughout the interface and presentation, which clearly delineates aspects of the screen. The enemies, the text boxes, the player square, and various windows and pop-ups are all visually distinct and are easy to identify for necessary functions. While Undertale does fail in some aspects, such as its intense movements in some battles, the game is much better to look at because the art style is cohesive and clearly identifies the aspects of the game and reduces visual noise. This is actually a major issue in many games. Put yourself in my shoes. Imagine you just purchased Spyro the Reignited trilogy in 2020 because you were a huge fan of the originals, only to find out that not only are they completely unplayable, but that the game has incapacitated you for days. This was not an issue in the original games, which I can play just fine, even now. Additionally, the 2-hour window Steam provides for refunds is not sufficient to determine if a game can cause migraines, which means that I'm just stuck with this piece of shit in my library. Thanks! If only people could figure out why I'm not interested in the professional space for game development considering how frequent this experience is. When I am not spending too much time trying to figure out what's on screen, not only am I missing out on the game itself, but I'm also getting increasingly sick. The issue doesn't just trigger migraines, but it can also make parts of the screen too difficult to tell apart when I'm having mental health episode, both of which can disrupt my health for days if unintentionally triggered. With regards to schizophrenia, what I experience is probably not what most people would expect. A lot of people construct their understanding of positive symptoms, aka hallucinations, delusions, voices, etc., as being the primary way that disables schizophrenics. I will admit that even for the last few weeks, I have been in an active positive episode, and, I have hallucinated, I have had delusions and stuff, things like that. However, while these stereotypical issues can be relevant in some situations, the primary issues with this disorder actually have to do with memory, perception, and understanding what elements communicate on a screen. When you're in an episode, it's very easy, for example, for text to transform into something else, or for things to feel like they're moving around. It is important to design user interfaces in a clear, consistent way to minimize difficulty in these episodes. When I'm having an episode, I often am not looking at the details, but rather vague contours or positioning, so consistency is also critically important. To understand better, here's an example of a failure I experienced when I was working professionally as a software developer. One time at work, I panicked because I quickly developed an episode and could no longer understand the user interface that I was looking at, and struggled for at least an hour to find the high contrast mode that made things more visible. I was forced into using this UI because the system was so broken and corrupt, it was the only one capable of organizing the program in a launchable manner, making my job suddenly inaccessible due to an arbitrary decision from other developers, and of course they weren't interested in listening. Sometimes I can spend considerable amount of time trying to find a UI element, or may forget what I'm doing halfway through it and need reminders. Because of the intense stereotyping of schizophrenic people, these serious accessibility lapses are not noticed or understood. However, what is nice is that accessibility standards that already exist for other issues, such as low vision or memory loss, can be significantly helpful in schizophrenic episodes. With these kinds of problems being prolific not just in Heartbound, but in many professional and high-budget titles, you may be asking why I do not offer my own consulting potential for large titles if this is such an issue.
Don't ask questions you aren't prepared to handle the answer to!
This is a complicated, multifaceted question. However, a major part of it largely comes down to knowing what I am worth as a laborer, knowing that I will not be paid what I am worth even remotely for my input, knowing that I will be subject to non-disabled superiors who will not respect my work beyond its consulting value, not being granted real creative or technical control in the project beyond accessibility suggestions, and, well, I can develop my own games without needing the help of someone else, and I can probably do it better, too, if this Nepo hire is anything to go by. I don't need help from a sector infamous within the tech industry for its continuous problems of sexual harassment and labor violations that have led to the first instances of unionization within the entire white-collar tech industry. I am of the opinion that disabled people often make the most interesting games anyway, without needing the help from non-disabled allies, who seem very interested in shoving themselves in the front of the picture. I am reminded of VG Storm, a blind game developer from the 2010s who was quite popular and innovative in developing expectations for blind players that would later shape commercial implementations, through shaping what blind people expected in RPG-style games. I simply cannot work for people who refuse to recognize the hard work of disabled people that I looked up to for their skill, innovation, and finesse. Not only this, but I've also seen how such privatized, siloed approaches to accessibility actually present themselves in the industry, closing off resources. Accessibility, after all, should not be a point used for competition, since it removes consumer choice for disabled people, but companies still do it anyway, such as Apple, and are even celebrated for it. This is simply not a culture that I can offer my experiences or expertise to, especially considering their continued professional ignorance of migraine disorders and their untrustworthy history with the handling of schizophrenia. Also, let's get real, it's also because I don't want to be assigned to some fucking liberal political trash like Israeli propaganda two-state simulator or literal military propaganda the game. You know, how one of the most funded accessibility projects in gaming is all just happen to be a game that is also very, very, very obviously Israeli propaganda to the point that even Time magazine has commented on it. Instead, I would rather offer this information publicly through my own experience, to allow all people to know what issues impact us. Perhaps those who would like to learn how to make games more accessible for us should watch our material instead. Also, if you want to sign a petition about that Israeli game thing, I have a link about that in the description. Even with these user interface improvements, I don't really think Heartbound is really a good game. It's still too empty and devoid of content, and given its complicated development history, it's unlikely that it will ever escape this state. However, I try to be positive. I think that there are many things that we can learn from by analyzing the mistakes of others. In fact, it is when the Faciality Machine breaks down that it gives us enough room to carefully analyze its context in granular detail, so that we can understand better how it functions in games where it does actually work, and how those games connect to other media and subjectivity-producing machines throughout society to produce the subjectivity of individuals that we see today. The masses, supporting continued international wars and exploitation of third-world countries, supported by the normalization of these ideas through the operant conditioning of modern media.